I read through the entire Filterverse manual, so you don't have to, and today I'm going to show you how this plugin works. Now just to start off, I'm going to play an audio example to show you what this plugin is capable of. And did you expect anything else than Darkside? I mean, look at how I'm dressed today. Now a quick message to say that this video is sponsored by Filterverse. They offered me an affiliate link, which is down in the description. And I did show this video to them before I'm showing it to you guys, so that they could help me with getting all of the details right. So thanks to them for sponsoring. Now let's get back into the walkthrough. Either way, this is a very good example still because it shows the nice versatility of this plugin. If I go into any of these sounds, and let's just listen to this one for example. You would say really crazy sound, sounds really nice, so the synth must be doing a lot of work. Well, if I actually turn off Filterverse, it's just the saw wave. And that is true for literally every sound in this project, except for the kick and bass. So this one over here. If I turn off Filterverse, just the saw wave. This amazing crazy atmosphere here. If I turn off Filterverse, it's just the saw wave. So as you can probably already tell, Filterverse is a very powerful plugin and there's a lot of different controls to get through. So let's open it up and see what it's all about. I've just opened up a new instance here. It opens up a little bit differently for you probably than it does for me because I've made the interface a little bit bigger and I've also changed some other settings. But of course, I'm going to go over everything, so we'll get to that when we get to it. But we're going to start off with the main interface, which is divided up into 4 different components. You have the top bar over here. You have the main filter section, you have the modulation section, and then you have the bottom bar. And starting at the top, we start off with the global settings over here. This is where we can set the GUI scale, the CPU quality, and the way that the knobs work. This knob mode is actually a pretty cool feature. If you leave it at round, the knob is actually going to be a round knob, and you have to move your mouse around it like this. And if you set it to linear, like this, what will happen is it will act kind of like a slider in that you have to drag up or down on it. After that, we have the tuning area over here where you can set the root note, the root frequency, and you can drop in tuning files. We also have MIDI control here for the pitch wheel, which is important if you're modulating. And then finally, we have some default settings for presets, mainly the author name of the preset that you're making. Of course, this is mostly interesting if you intend to redistribute your presets, or for personal use if you have multiple different artist names and you want to kind of separate them into different styles and different genres that you may work on. Now quickly before we continue, I want to say if you enjoyed this video so far, let me know by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed while you're there. Of course, these videos take a lot of time to make, so if you want to help grow it in the algorithm, 2 good ways of doing that is by leaving an interesting comment down below or telling some of your friends about this video so that they can go watch as well. But with that being said, let's get back into Filterverse. Now back in the top bar, as you can see, we have our 3 main filters. You can just switch between the controls for all 3 of them. And this is where you can turn on and off those filters and also select the filter type by clicking here. Furthermore, you can switch between them like this as well. Then after that, we have the routing area where you can select between the 5 different routing options. The routing options that you have available are all filters in series, all filters in parallel, 1 filter in series with 2 filters in parallel, 2 filters in parallel in series with 1 filter after that. And then we have 2 filters in series totally in parallel with 1 other filter. I feel like the way that I'm explaining it is a little bit more complex than the actual diagrams here, so do with that what you will. I mean, you can just look at the diagrams and then you should probably understand what is happening with the signal path and how the filters are actually inserted in said signal path. And you may think like, okay, this is not enough different routing options. I want a combination of all of the different filters and all of the different possibilities. Well, what you can actually do is you can actually just move these around. So as you can see now, filter 2 starts off and then we have filter 1 and filter 3. And that is reflected in here, meaning that with these 5 options, you can actually get any combination of parallel and series processing between these 3 filters. After that, we have undo and redo options over here. And then finally, we have a bypass. And that brings us down into the main filter control, where you're going to be controlling the filters that the plugin is actually using. Now, for all of the different filter types, the controls are going to be very similar in terms of their structure. There are going to be some sliders that are different, but most of what you're going to see is going to be the same for every different filter here. So starting off on the left here with the controls, this isn't really a control, this is more monitoring for both the input gain, MIDI notes, and control voltage. We then have an overall input slider over here, and that then goes into our main filter cutoff. We also have the resonance over here, and then we have our 4 main variable sliders. Sometimes these 2 knobs also have a different name, but functionally speaking, they tend to be the most important parameters, and they tend to be closely related to a filter cutoff. Then after the actual filter controls, we have a dry wet over here, a panning down below, and then in between we have the phase. So you can actually phase invert the signal coming out of the filter. We have a little option over here which turns on mid-side processing for this particular filter. So this is dependent on the filter that you're using, and you can see here it turns off again. So you can have each individual filter either process left and right separately or process the mid and side signals separately. And then finally we have an output gain and output monitoring over here to the side. Then over here is the modulator area. As you can see, nothing is loaded right now, and I'm actually going to get back into the modulation system and all of the different modulators in a little bit. So let's move on to the bottom bar over here where you can see the Polyverse logo, which just shows you registration information and also a button that allows you to update the plugin. We then have a button to initialize the preset as well as the preset browser over here, which pops out like this. And finally we have global dry wet controls, a main output over here, a monitoring, and then finally clipping options where you can switch between no clipping, hard clipping, and soft clipping. Now let's have a look at the actual interesting part of this video, which are going to be the filters that exist within Filterverse. There's actually 26 different devices that you can put in here. I say devices because there's also this bypass thing and there's some delays, there's some other things in here. But most of these are of course going to be filters, and that is actually what they're referred to in the manual. So we're going to start off with the Swiss Army knife over here, which is the very first filter in the list. This is described in the manual as a fairly juicy filter, but it's mainly used for just general purpose filtering, as it is very versatile in the different shapes that it can create. It is also a variable state filter, meaning that you can smoothly morph between a 2-pole filter and a 4-pole filter. Finally, this filter also has the ability to self-oscillate. So if I turn this up all the way to above 10, maybe into 12, you can see that it actually turns red here, it turns red here, and that is indicating that the filter is now self-oscillating. So if we put any sound into this filter, it will continue to oscillate forever. And this filter is also capable of saturation, which you can control with this drive over here. The next filter in the list is the bread and butter, which, as the icon cleverly suggests, as you can see here, is a ladder filter. This means that it's based on the ladder filter architecture, which is a particular type of electronic circuit which is being emulated here. It is actually very popular coming out of the Moog synthesizer, and the name is actually based on the layout of the electronic circuit looking like a ladder. This type of filter is actually known for its very strong distinctive resonance, and this is very useful if you're making something like a 303 sound or really anything else that uses very strong, very characterful resonance. And again, this filter can also self-oscillate, as well as being driven with some saturation here. The next filter is the evil filter, which really lives up to its name, as it can be used to dial in some very strong tones. both through the drive up here as well as to this damage parameter. And because of the wide range of settings, not just with the drive and the damage, but also with this pulse over here, there's a nice table inside of the manual which allows you to see exactly what all of the different combination of settings are doing. One thing to note here is that the damage parameter is bipolar, so going up like this has a different influence than going down like this. The next filter is the deep cutter, which again, as the name suggests, is very specific for one goal. In this case, it is very specifically designed to be very steep. And as you can see, we can set the pulse up to 16, which as you can see results in this very steep drop-off of 96 dBs per octave. Now this is technically still a musical filter, so it isn't exactly like a brick wall filter. We will have a look at a more brick wall filter later, which is in fact even steeper. So in essence, this is a very smooth way to get very steep filtering. And that then brings us to the brick wall filter, which as you can see at 12 poles is even steeper than the deep cutter is at 16 poles. It is characterized with less smoothness. It also cannot self-oscillate like the deep cutter can. As you can see, the resonance only goes up to 10. And finally, there's no drive setting here, meaning that this filter cannot saturate. And it is specifically designed to be a very clean and linear way of filtering. One other interesting thing is the types here. As you can see, we just have a low pass and a high pass. So there's no band pass in here even. So really, I would say this filter is pretty much designed to just do, say, low frequency cutting or high frequency cutting on specific sound sources that have too many of those frequencies and where you really just want to chop off any content above a certain frequency. The next filter that we have is the equalize filter. As you can see, this is just a low shelf like you're used to in your EQ. We also have bells here, so we can set it like this. And then we have a high shelf here, which we can turn up and down as well. This is actually a fairly interesting filter because at default, it doesn't really do anything. You really need to dial in the gain here before this filter actually starts having a function. So keep that in mind if you're experimenting with these filters yourself. The next filter in the list is this clear glass filter, which is designed to be as transparent as possible. And it has a really cool feature in that if you put this slider to the middle, it is basically non-existent. So you can set this exactly to 2. And now we have an entirely flat frequency response. This means that you can actually morph between a flat frequency response and say a low pass filter or a high pass filter, which might be really interesting for you if you need that very transparent filter and you want it to maybe come in over time. That way you can maybe automate this parameter here and you can do some maybe filter transitions or stuff like that and do it in a very, very clean way. So now we're getting a little bit into the more complex filters with this dueling bands over here. This is a very interesting setup with 2 different band passes, which you can set with the spread here. And of course you can set center position with the filter cutoff. The interesting thing about these band passes is that one of them has its output signal phase inverted. So there's some really interesting cancelling that is going on if you put the spread at a very low position. Next up, we have the vowel filter, which is of course known for emulating the mouth movements of human beings. You still have the cutoff, which is kind of responsible for almost like the pitch of the mouth that you're generating. So this will create a lower voice and this will create a higher voice. And then you have positions for both the lips as well as the tongue within the mouth. If I actually put this lower, you can actually see the differences here. And finally, there's also different types of filters that can be used for these different vowels, as it's mainly based on the resonant peaks of these filters. So you can go for a low pass version, you can go for a band pass version, a high pass version, or a peak version. Next up is the ripples filter, which just looks like a brick wall filter, but if you actually turn the resonance up, you can see that there's extra peaks coming in with it, which is very interesting. You can of course set the amount of peaks that you have over here. And as you can imagine, with those peaks in the spectrum, it can lead to some very interesting filtering ideas. If you're a little bit of a physics nerd like me, then the next filter might be interesting for you. This is called the double slit filter, and it essentially kind of emulates the interference of the original double slit experiment where this filter is named after, but in the frequency spectrum. And honestly, with this kind of filter, it is really hard to explain what all of that means, and you just kind of have to experiment with it. I'm actually recording the whole voiceover part before I record all of the individual filter examples, which I'm going to put in this video. So I hope that the example that I'm going to give in this part is actually going to show a little bit what this filter is capable of. The next phase filter, as the name kind of suggests, is a phasor. As you can see, we have kind of like phasor peaks in the spectrum here, and you can select up to 8 peaks. We also have the depth here, which can set either how deep the filter kind of cuts or semi-boost, but also cuts in the same way. Of course, this is also influenced by the resonance. And finally, of course, there's the spread here, which determines how wide the phasor effect is going to be within the spectrum itself. So you can actually very narrowly have a phasor like this, or you can just have a very wide phasor on the whole frequency spectrum. Now, of course, with Filterverse being all about filters, they're not just going to have your basic phasor. So what they did here was actually a very crazy idea. Imagine that all of these individual peaks over here, instead of just being a peak, instead of just almost acting like a bandpass in a way, that they are in and of themselves an actual phasor. So you can see that you have a nesting amount here, which sets how many times that actually happens. So you can have a phasor for every peak. You can then have a phasor for every peak of that phasor that is in and of itself a peak of the phasor. And that of course goes hand in hand with this peaks amount over here, which just in general determines the amount of peaks each phasor is going to have. There's some other interesting controls here, like the pinch, which is essentially like the spread as well, but it acts on all of the phasors. And then we have a depth knob over here, which determines how strong that effect is going to be. Next up, we have the flange filter, which I don't think I have to explain is going to be a flanger. Of course, you're going to have both negative flangers and positive flangers. And because this filter type is inherently based on delays, the resonance is actually going to be the feedback amount of those delays. So you can see if I turn it up, it kind of becomes like almost like a delay tail here. But with flangers, the delays are so tiny that this isn't really like the traditional feedback of your delay. Finally, there's the cross feedback. If you have different processing for the left and the right channel, this is very interesting because it allows you to take the feedback from the left channel and kind of cross that over in the right channel and vice versa, and just doing that over and over again. And of course, you can set an amount of that happening over here. Next up, we have vacuum here, which is based on comb filtering. Of course, that is a fairly similar effect to a flanger, but it just has some slightly different controls, mainly the pulls over here. And in general, comb filters kind of get their name from the distinctive kind of comb that you're going to get in the spectrum. So in the example, I'll hopefully have a spectrum up somewhere so that you can actually see what is happening with the comb filter. Now we're going to get even deeper into more interesting stuff with this strings filter. This is really cool if you're into physical modeling because it emulates the behavior of sound going through strings. You can also set the position of where this sound is going to be recorded from. So if you want it very close to the edge of the string where the string would connect to like a physical weight that itself doesn't move. Of course, the strings are going to be moving and that is the whole point of this emulation. One word of warning coming from the manual is that this filter can self-oscillate in ways that you may not want to. If that ever happens, if you continuously get self-oscillation for a setting where you don't want that to happen, there's this little button over here with actually all filters, where you can stop the buffer and any self-oscillation that is happening actually gets cut off. Now for the other controls, some of this stuff is very, very complex, so I'm going to actually show you what the manual itself says. But the way that I'm going to describe it is that the timbre is going to change the tonality of the sound, and here with the detune you can kind of wash out the sound in an interesting way. In reality, what is happening with the detune is that there's actually tuning differences between the three strings being emulated, and one is going to be in the center, one is going to be in the left channel, and one is going to be in the right channel. So increasing the detuning can also enhance the stereo field. Next up is RoboComp, which gets its name from the robotic sounds that it can reproduce. And just with the fractalize, what we saw with the nested phasers, what you can also have is nested comb filters. In this case though, it isn't nested in the frequency spectrum, but it's actually emulating nesting in the actual electronic scheme of these kind of filters. The way that comb filters are traditionally implemented is that you have a delay unit and then it feeds back into itself. But what you can also do is have a delay unit and then another comb filter. So you essentially have multiple different comb filters inside of each other. The amount of comb filters that are nested and the way that they are nested are actually set over here. And that is of course represented with the graph over here as well. So you can see we have two comb filters with two comb filters nested in them each. And this is actually a very funny way of displaying that kind of information, which I find really cool. Once again, there's a few extra controls over here as well, like the symmetry and the stretching. The symmetry has to do with exactly how the delays are tuned within the comb filters, all of the individual delays that actually make up the comb filter. And then the stretching here stretches or squeezes the effect over the frequency spectrum. Again, this is very technical, but specifically here in the manual, there's a note that they explain things in a very technical way, but that you just have to experiment with it to actually learn how it works. It is pretty funny reading through 82 pages of a manual only to find a message that basically says yeah, we're telling you how things work, but to really understand this plugin, you just have to play with it. Kind of feels like my Wednesday evening was a little bit wasted. Next up, we have the space filter over here, which is emulating actually a reverb. And in my opinion, it does that so well that you can actually use this plugin as a dedicated reverb if you wanted to. Of course, you're not going to have the maximum amount of controls that you would get with an actual dedicated reverb plugin, say the thing that I'm using, M Turbo Reverb, where you're going to have much more control over the reverb if you want to. But it is good enough that you can definitely dial in some very interesting reverb tones. In this case, the cutoff is actually determining the size of the reverb and the resonance is determining the decay length. For those who are familiar with the reverb plugin inside of Serum, this is going to be very, very similar to that. But I've noticed that the decay length of this filter can actually be much longer than the one in Serum. The next filter is coils, which is again very interesting for physical modeling. This time though, within its processing, it actually uses comb filters. And as you can imagine from the name, it is going to emulate the behavior that you get of sounds going through a coil. The decimate filter allows you to do downsampling, but it does it in very interesting ways because you have very strong control of the actual algorithm that is used for the downsampling. Nor you don't really have control over the exact algorithm that you're using or the exact way that you're interpolating in the sample and hold of the downsampling. It also has a bit crushing algorithm in there, which you can set over here, and you can set the position of where that happens within the signal chain of the downsampling itself. Now the manual on this filter is going to be 3 pages long, so I'm not going to go over all of these individual types here and all of the individual effects that these filters are going to have. I'm just going to flash that part of the manual up on the screen, so if you want to read that, you can pause the video. The next filter in the list is Cabinator, which is going to be a cabinet emulation, as the name suggests again. like these names pretty much describe themselves. I don't really have to say exactly what the filter does because most of the time you can just see it from the name. That being said, you can see that you can have different cabinets over here, different cabinet types. You can also determine the mic placement, which means that either you're going to have a very on-close sound or you're going to get more and more of the room sound as well. Here you can set the gain parameter of the cabinet or how hard it is driven into that cabinet. And then finally, you can set the tonality of the cabinet as well. Actually, I said finally, but I should also talk about these controls here, which are going to be the size of the cabinet. So you can literally just model the cabinet becoming bigger physically and smaller. And with the cabinet parameter, you can kind of exaggerate the peaks and troughs that the cabinet is going to generate on the sound. So you can have 200% up here. So this is going to be kind of like an exaggerated version of the cabinet. And you can turn that down all the way to 0 if you don't really want the effect. Or at least the tonal shaping part of the cabinet. Of course, you're still going to get like mic placement and that kind of stuff. Finally, we're going to have a look into the delays. Now there's 4 different delays here. We start off with a basic delay. So you have delay time over here. And then we have the feedback amount. Here again, this is technically like self-oscillating, but in this case, it's not really self-oscillating. It is more, think of it like a feedback that is over 100%. So the signal gets louder as it continues to loop in the feedback circuit. You have dampening options here for both the low frequencies and the high frequencies. And then again, you have this crossfade parameter over here, which means that the left and the right channel can again kind of talk to each other and actually cross over for every loop that it does in the feedback circuit. And then finally here you have more tempo options, which allows you to use either triplets, normal flats, or dotted notes. If there is one personal suggestion that I can make to improve this plugin, one thing that I would have liked to see is that this parameter would not be like snapping and instead would be smooth, so that you could set a timing over here, set 1/8 for example, and then smoothly morph between the normal 1/8 delay and then a dotted 1/8 delay or a triplet 1/8 delay. I think there could be some cool, interesting things that you could do with that. But honestly, this plugin is complex enough that I understand why they wouldn't do something like that. Next up is Tampon, which is going to be a ping pong version, so the left and right are going to be alternating. You can see though that there's multiple different circuits here, so you can kind of mix between different ways that it morphs between them. Again, there's a whole diagram that explains exactly how this works, so I'm not going to go over each of the different types. I'll just show that diagram if you're interested in it. In this case, that does mean that we don't have any low frequency damping. We do have high frequency damping over here. We also have the stereo parameter, which determines whether the ping pong either starts on the left or the right channel. You can also set it to the center, which just turns it into a normal delay. So this could be a really cool way of morphing between a normal delay and then like slowly turning that into a ping pong delay or something. And again, over here, you have the final slider, which is going to be time divisions. Now temp pitch is actually based on granular delay. So as you can see, you have a pitch control over here. So the fact that this is based on the granular engine allows you to kind of pitch shift the delay up or down over time, because this pitch shifting is happening in the feedback loop. So every time it delays, it can go higher and higher and higher in pitch, or lower and lower and lower in pitch. And again, some of these other settings we've already seen before, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. The last filter that we're going to take a look at is Yaled Opmet. It is actually tempo delay in reverse, which is very interesting because as far as I know, this doesn't reverse the delay. What is actually happening here is that this is a tempo synced granular delay. The interesting control over here is going to be the phase, which from the manual, I don't exactly understand what it's doing, but it seems to be very interesting. And it says in the manual that modulating this stuff can result into some very, very cool, like desyncing of the delays in interesting ways from the actual beat. And that leaves us with the final module that you can load in these instances, which is going to be the bypass. Now this seems fairly useless because these knobs are not going to do anything and there isn't any extra sliders in here. But this still might be interesting for you if you're looking to, say, modulate the volume or modulate the panning of a sound. Or you already have two filters in here and all that you want to do is phase invert it again. Then you can just use it and turn on the phase invert here. So definitely not a useless module, even though technically it doesn't really do anything. It's just giving you the extra controls that you have over here. The next thing that we, of course, have to talk about is what is going on in here. As you can see right now, there isn't really anything going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to go over all of the individual modulators, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the modulation system as well. So we're going to start off with the meta knob here, which is just a knob. Like, it doesn't really seem to do much, but what you can do with it is you can modulate multiple different parameters. So let's go back into this thing over here. What I could do is modulate like this and modulate like this. And now both of these parameters are going to go up and down based on where this knob position is going to be. There are some extra cool things that you can do in here though. One, you can quantize these to, as you can see, different scales. And what this is useful for is if you have any parameter that is kind of key dependent, like for example the filter cutoff of a filter, which as you can see is actually displayed in octaves here. So one of the interesting features of this filter plugin is that it's potentially very musical. and having the modulation be quantized allows for very interesting musical ideas. For example, a filter that self-oscillates only in a certain key. Next up, we have the polarity button over here. Every modulator is going to have a polarity button where you can either have it unipolar or bipolar. So it's bipolar here. You have it unipolar going away up and then unipolar going down as well. And then the final parameter here is the glide, which basically introduces a little bit of lag into this. Now, if you're a preset maker, you're going to love this stuff. What you can do is you can actually rename this. So let's say that this is intensity. You can basically have a macro that kind of explains what it's doing. So if you're giving a preset to someone, it is immediately clear what this meta knob is actually doing within the actual sound itself. The next modulator is going to be the ADSR, which is of course an envelope. This ADSR is going to be triggered by any MIDI node coming in. So you'll have to route your MIDI nodes into this plugin in order to actually use this. But you can see we just have attack, decay, release, and sustain, and then velocity sensitivity over here as well. Next up, we have the sequencer, which is also kind of acting like an LFO, as you can see. You can just see that it's kind of going through the sequence right now. And you can set a rate over here. You can, of course, also have it free running. So you can set a rate in hertz instead if you want to. We also have retriggering options so that the sequencer can listen again to incoming MIDI notes. And then we have bipolar options here. Next up, we have the shape, which is really interesting because this isn't like an actual LFO, but it's based on these steps here. What you can do is kind of define how the steps are interpolated. So just scrolling up here, you can see that there's different ways that you can interpolate here. And there's some really cool things that you can do with keyboard shortcuts. If you want to go like here, 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 I'm just pressing A, C, D, B. We have the amount of steps that are actually being used here. So turning this up or down determines how many steps are in the actual sequence. And then finally, you can introduce some swing if you want to. Usually it's fairly important that whatever swing that you're using also already exists in your project. So if you're working with a sound that already has some swing on it and you want the modulation to be precisely on the notes, then this is where you set that up. And then finally over here, we have the patterns. So there's some predefined patterns in here. In fact, there is 100 predefined patterns. And I'm just scrolling through them right now. And then finally, we have a random pattern. There's some really cool stuff in that you can randomize the pattern continuously and kind of scroll up and down until you find something that you like. And as you can see, the shape also changes here. So this is randomized every time you generate a new random pattern, meaning that also the way that is being interpolated in the patterns changes every time you generate a new random pattern. Finally, because again, this is based on steps, we can also move those steps forwards and backwards, as well as invert them like this. So as you can probably tell, this is one of the more powerful modulators, again, also because it just kind of works within the sequence. You don't have to send it MIDI for it to work, although you can, of course. The next modulator that we're going to take a look at is the oscillator over here. Now, this isn't the same as an LFO, like this isn't doing LFO work because this is actually running in audio rate. So if you're into audio rate modulation, this is where you do that. Of course, we have the tuning over here, so you can tune it up and down with the coarse pitch, the fine tuning, and then you have a multiplication factor over here as well. We can then control the overall shape of this oscillator to shift between a couple of different basic shapes here. We can also set it to noise. In this case, the shape is actually going to pinch it and the pitch is going to be used as a low pass, high pass filter. So in this case, we're basically setting how fast the noise is actually going to modulate up and down and randomize up and down. The phase parameter, of course, over here, it's just going to be the phase. So it's going to set the starting position of the actual oscillator. But in the noise type, it is going to be the noise seed. So you can see that every time we are at a certain position, the noise kind of changes. But it's always going to use the same exact randomization for phase setting over here. Next up, again, we have a glide, which is going to be like an introduction of lag, like we saw in the meta knob as well. And then we have actual audio settings over here, so you can turn it up and get some actual audio output. Currently, it's not playing because I had it muted there, but if I turn this on, we can hear some noise. So this allows you to actually debug the signal that you're listening to. And of course, you can also just use it as an actual oscillator. Finally, we have some more MIDI controls, like if it re-triggers on a MIDI note, or if it should listen to incoming MIDI signals and actually use that as the pitch. And if this is active, you can, of course, still have the tuning over here to actually tune away from the MIDI notes that you're playing. So, for example, you could have it an octave up by setting this to 12 here. The next modulator is going to be the envelope follower. So if you have incoming audio signal and you want to use its dynamics to actually trigger different parts of the filtering, to actually modulate different parameters, then this is where you do that. You can either listen to the left input, the right input, both of the left and right inputs, and that's also true for the sidechain input as well as the output. We have a threshold over here to determine when this envelope is actually going to trigger. So anytime the signal goes above the threshold, it is going to trigger this particular envelope where we can set an attack and release as well. And as I said before, this is mainly used if you have something, say, rhythmical that you want to actually use to trigger modulations, whether that be the input signal itself, the sidechain signal. So if you have like a drum loop and you want to modulate something on a pad and you want that modulation to kind of take the shape of the drum loop, then you would use the sidechain input for that. But another interesting thing is that you can go into the output, and that means that part of the modulation is going to impact how the output is going to sound, and therefore you almost have like this recursive kind of idea. Next up, we have controls for MIDI input as well as control voltage input. In this case, what it's going to do, it's going to take audio signals either in the sidechain left-right channel or in the control voltage left-right channel and use that as a modulation source. So you can again do audio rate modulation, but this is really more useful for control voltage. So if you have a control voltage actually recorded on a track somewhere, or you're inputting that from your audio interface or something, you would route that to the actual plugin, either through the sidechain or through the main inputs. And then you can use it as a modulation source over here. And of course, with the MIDI stuff, you can use stuff like the note pitch, the velocity. It basically just says over here what you can use, and use that as a modulation source. Again, this comes with a glide option so that you can introduce a little bit of lag here, a little bit of smoothing basically, which again can be very interesting. But I would say that this is probably one of the easier modulators to understand. Next up, we have the random modulator, which is very, very cool, of course, if you want to just have continuously randomly generating sequences. One of the interesting things is that you can also randomly change the sequence steps. So right now we have a rate of 1, and we can introduce extra divisions in that rhythmically. So as you can see, every time that the rate resets, it's going to basically chop this up into multiple different steps. And for each step, it's going to generate a random value. So normally it generates a random value every bar, but sometimes you can have it generated faster. And you can set the musical subdivisions that it's going to use for that. Again, we have options over here in order to make it free running. So you can set the rate in hertz as opposed to just tempo synced. We have a retrigger options, whether it retriggers on receiving a MIDI input or not. And then again, we have unipolar options. In this case, it just turns on or off. So either you have bipolar modulation or you have positive unipolar modulation. We have glide again for the lag that we talked about before. Again, we can quantize the random signal to musical scale. And then we finally have a range control over here, which is set in octaves, which is just going to determine the overall modulation range. The final modulator here is pitch detection. So again, this has a very musical approach to it, where you can take an incoming pitch and actually assign that to a filter cutoff, for example. Again, you can use the left channel, the right channel, both the left and the right channel in the input, and that together with the sidechain as well. We have options here for where it's going to detect it. Is it going to detect it in the high frequencies, middle frequencies, and low frequencies? And then finally, we have a glide over here. Now, I already did it before, but assigning a modulation is very easy. All you have to do is click on any of these little knobs that you see here. So this is the sign for a parameter can be modulated. So you just click on it and then you set the modulation amount. Now let's turn on a few extra modulators here. Let's just go like this. It automatically loads them up with the different modulators that are available actually. And now if I go like this, you can see that we have all of the different parameters here. And if I set it up with multiple modulations, you can actually see that that's reflected both in here, as well as showing which of the modulators are used within each individual filter. So here I can say do this, 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 and now it's going to show, okay, the first 3 modulators are used in this filter, and these modulators are used in this filter. An interesting thing that you'll also see now that we have added extra modulations is that each modulator can be modulated. So what that's going to do is it's basically going to act like an aux source inside of Serum. So we're now going to be modulating the amount of modulation that this modulator is going to provide to all of the points where it's assigned. You cannot do it for individual points, I believe. It will just do it kind of globally. So all of the assignments that I've made over here are going to be controlled by the sequence 5, which I'm using to modulate this one. One interesting quirk of the modulation system is that it's not exactly linear, in that the first 25% of the modulation curve, you're going to have greater detail. So when you're down below here, this is going to be actually smaller changes than what you would expect for the modulation amounts that is set here. And that means that you can have very, very precise modulations if you want to, so like very small deviations if you want to. And then after 25%, it's just going to be linear. Another thing that is interesting is what happens when you click these buttons down below here, which allows for separate modulation on the left and right channel. We have now linked them, so as you can see, they're always going to be opposite of each other, but you can also unlink them and then you can set a separate modulation for the left and the right channel. And this is again interesting if you want a little bit of variety in the stereo field, if you want the left channel and the right channel to do something differently, or with the mid-side processing enabled if you want the mid channel and the side channel to do something differently. Now the final thing that I want to show with the modulation is that you can actually see what the modulation is doing. So if I modulate this parameter like this, and then I use another parameter like this one, the oscillator, what you'll see over here is the actual sum of the two modulations. So you can see exactly where a parameter is at any given time. And because some of these modulators rely on MIDI signal, the final thing that I have to talk about in the modulation system is the legato over here, which is going to determine whether a modulation is reset if two notes are played at the same time. So if you play one note, don't release it, then play a second note if that second note is going to re-trigger. Or if you don't want that to happen, it will only re-trigger modulations if all of the notes are released and then new notes are triggered. So that brings us to the final part of the interface, which is going to be the stuff down below here. Of course, we looked through it already, but the main interesting thing that we still haven't looked at is the preset browser. As you can see, it opens up like this, but you can make it bigger and smaller. In the middle is going to be where you have your presets, and then on the right is where the tag system is, which is fairly interesting. One of the cool things that it does is if you select a tag, new tags will pop up so that you can look even further. So if you want something rhythmical, formant, and then you want something for drums, then you can do it like that. And of course, clicking on it again will unselect them and you'll get more different options again. On the right, you're going to see preset info, who has made the preset, what the name is of the preset. You can also favorite the preset here, but also here. And you can see and set the tags here. Now, an interesting thing is that this also comes with custom tags. So if I want to add a tag here, I can say custom tag. I can add that there. And now I have a custom tag over here, which will always appear over here. So if I quickly close out of this plugin, create a new audio track, and then open Filterverse again, you can see that the custom tag is still here. And this means that you can have kind of like a bunch of different folders that are always going to show up on top. Of course, also the favorite folder is going to show here. So if you ever favorite a preset, then you're just going to have your favorites over here. And of course, clicking on that tag is just going to show you the presets that actually fall into that folder. Now say that you have a particular preset that you already know that you want to look for example preset 1, which is a preset that I made earlier. This isn't coming with the factory. You're not going to be able to find this. But if you already know the name of the preset that you're looking for, then you can search for it there. We also have sorting options over here, where you can sort by name, by author, by date, and you can flip the ordering of the list as well. We also have this possibility. You can just see like a very basic version of the preset where it's just the name and the favorite button. You can see a little bit more information like the author and the date. Or you can see a lot of information here, even some description. It just depends on how much real estate you want to dedicate to each preset, or if you want to just kind of quickly scroll through it. Finally, for saving presets, you can do that up here by just giving it a name, and then saving it. And now if I want to add tags or something like that, I can do that as well. So now if I go into the drum stack, of course, it will show up right there. So that's Filterverse. That is basically everything you need to know in order to use the plugin. Of course, you could have just used the plugin and started experimenting with it yourself. And that is mainly what I would recommend for actually knowing how the plugin works and how it feels. But hopefully this gives you an idea of exactly what you can expect from this plugin. Now, if you enjoyed this kind of content and you want to see more of it, please let me know. I'm already planning on doing a similar video with Serum because a lot of people have asked me. But as you can imagine, with Serum also being a very massive plugin, that is also going to be a very big video. But either way, if you're interested in that, let me know and leave a like down below. Another way you can support the channel is to do so financially, which you can do over on my Patreon page, or you can check out some of my products on my Gumroad, my Pay page, as well as Andrena Krom's store, which is fairly new. So thanks for that, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.